So, hi everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the Biome podcast with me, Emma, and Robi and Kate. So this week we are going to be talking about climate change. Ooh. And yes, a big topic. So we're going to split it into two parts. Kate, do you want to explain a bit more how this is going to work?
Yeah, so obviously climate change is super complex and just a massive topic, and we really want to be able to do it justice and cover as much information as we can to kind of help you guys understand what climate change is, what can be done about it, impacts, consequences, and kind of what we can do as individuals, and then all the way up to kind of government level change. So we're going to split this into two parts, so 2 episodes, and episode 1, part 1, will be an overview of climate change, and that's what we're going to be doing today. So what it is, what the impacts of climate change are, and what the consequences of those impacts are, and what is at stake if we do nothing to kind of combat climate change now. And then part 2, we're going to look at what we can do about climate change in our day-to-day lives, what collective organisations can do, and what governments can do. So that's going to be much more action-based. So we'll be weighing up which of these kind of groups of people has the greatest impact and the kind of differences between them. We really want to highlight that we can all make a difference, and the actions of every single individual are really powerful. We want you to feel empowered by the end of it to make a difference, rather than overwhelmed at the task of, tackling the climate crisis.
Which is kind of why we split it in 2, because we thought,
yeah,
we'll give you something manageable. I think when we were deciding it, I think it was you, Kate, who messaged like, shall we split it up, because I don't think I can handle the whole thing. And I was like, yes, this is going to be far too stressful.
Yeah, it would have been like a 4-hour long episode, so we don't want to talk too much.
Yeah, exactly. We thought it'd be too much for us to record and too much for you guys to listen to in one sitting. But we're also going to be making a series of kind of shorter social bites that will go out on our Instagram and YouTube about the kind of key biomes and ecosystems we need in order to mitigate the effects of climate change. And we're going to be talking about things like soils, oceans, seagrasses, mangroves, forests, wetlands, like all these allies that we have in climate change, and we want to give them all a bit of a shout out.
Not to mention the tiger sharks, who I will mention in the social bite, because they are allies in the fight against global climate change.
No, but I think those nature-based solutions are so important, so we're going to definitely talk about those.
Yeah, exactly. So Emma, do you want to kind of start by explaining what climate change is?
So basically, climate change describes these sort of complex shifts that are affecting our planet's weather and climate systems. So we do want to mention, so climate change, it doesn't just encompass rising average global temperature. So that's what we mean when we talk about global warming. But it's also encompassing more extreme weather events. So with climate change, what will happen is that some places will become drier, some will become wetter, some will become hotter, some will become colder. It's not a blanket, everywhere is going to get warmer. And around the world, the effects of climate change won't be the same everywhere. So currently on Earth, the average temperature is about 15 degrees Celsius, and important to note as well that in the past it has been much hotter and much colder, and it always will be and will continue to be, because we have these natural fluctuations in the global climate. But what's different about the climate change we're experiencing now is that global temperatures are rising faster than ever, than they have done in history of planet Earth. And kind of this is due to anthropogenic or human activity. So kind of, I think anthropogenic global climate change is probably the best way that we can describe this. But the climate's always changing. Do you want to explain, Robi, what's happened sort of in the past with that? How
this is
changed?
For me, I think one of the most interesting kind of aspects about the discussion around global climate change, because you get a lot of people who, people who deny that global climate change is a problem will have this argument that the climate is constantly changing, therefore this current change is nothing to worry about. And even if you believe in it, but you might not quite understand it, as loads of people do, and as I didn't as fully as I should do until I started researching this, it's a very interesting thing to get your head around. So it is true that the global climate is constantly in flux, And the last 2 million years or so of Earth's history, and we've only been around for kind of 1,200,000 if you're being less generous, but the last 200 years of Earth's history have been incredibly turbulent, climatically speaking. So we're currently in the Holocene epoch. Some people say the Anthropocene, but I still technically think the jury's out on that. So we're in the Holocene, which began around 12,000, 11,500 years ago. Prior to that, and until 2 million years ago, it was the Pleistocene. And the Pleistocene is what we...
Your favourite
I am
period in
unapologetic for my
history.
love of the Pleistocene. Everything was bigger, everything was better. You had 6-foot-tall gophers with wings. It was fantastic. And the Pleistocene is what we call the Ice Ages. There wasn't just one Ice Age, there was a series of Ice Age. And the Pleistocene was characterized by this kind of, like, really kind of steep, if you drew a squiggle on a graph, a really kind of severe climate fluctuations. And so the cold periods, when Earth's temperature plummeted, was called the Glacial Periods. And you had these massive ice caps along most of Eurasia and North America. Sea levels dropped, so Britain was connected to Europe. Most of South Asia, or the islands were all mainland. And then these ice caps would retreat, and the Earth would warm, and these were called Interglacial Periods. So during the glacial periods, what you'd consider the ice ages, when it got really cold, you'd have cold-adapted megafauna like woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, and you had this great mammoth steppe which kind of stretched around Eurasia. And then during the interglacial periods, those cold species would retreat north, and the warm species, which had been locked in these glacial refugia, would come out. And so you had straight-tusked elephants instead of mammoths, and interglacial rhinos instead of woolly rhinos. And this was this really kind of severe cyclical pattern during the Pleistocene of glacial, interglacial, interglacial, glacial, glacial, interglacial. And it happened for around 2 million years. And so actually...
So that would have been quite extreme temperature changes,
more than what we've
wouldn't it?
currently got at the minute in some of the hottest interglacials and the coldest glacials. And so actually, the designation of the Holocene as the current epoch is entirely a human... It's only because we want our own area. Technically, the Holocene is nothing more than the latest in a long line of Pleistocene interglacials. So it is correct to say that naturally our planet is in a warming period, and next in line is an ice age. We're actually slightly overdue for an ice age, which will, be fun. So, okay, that's where we've been. Why is it now a problem if we know that we're in a natural warming period? Well, the problem is that current warming rates far exceed any of the previous warming period. So we're talking about the speed of warming. This is what's the problem. Previously, each time the climate warmed, it did so over a period of 1,000 years or so, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. And, your flora and your fauna had time to either shift their geographical ranges, north or south, or they had time to adapt into new kind of species to deal with the new temperatures. A few species went extinct, but most either kind of migrated or evolved. This time, however, the speed of the warming is such that it's far too fast and it's too quick for the plants and the animals to adapt. And because plants and animals have no time to adapt, they're going extinct. And they're going extinct at rates that are similar to the previous mass extinctions. So we talk about, the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs, the Permian mass extinction, the end Carboniferous mass extinction. And, extinctions are always happening somewhere, and they're natural. This is called the background rate of extinction. But every so often, because of these extreme climatic or geological processes, you get mass extinctions, which are these blips in the fossil record where, entire ecosystems just die out.
I think it's shocking. It's over 96% of life in some cases was wiped out in one go.
The Permian extinction, called the Great Dying, was the worst we've had yet. And now all the evidence suggests that we are in the 6th mass extinction. And the evidence suggests that we are the cause of these climatic processes. So this is why global climate change is a problem.
Yeah, and why it's really unique, because this is sort of the first time that one species has been the driver of these events rather than a kind of climatic or geological process, which I think we can all accept. We can't, we're never as powerful as nature can be when it throws these kind of mass extinction events. But this one lands on the shoulder of one species, which is incredibly unique. So that's another really big difference.
Yeah, and I think as well, I was watching a documentary recently, they put it quite nicely in the sense that we're having the same effect, so us as humans, as sort of big super volcanoes did in the past. Like the volcanic eruptions that caused extinctions in the past, we are acting like these super volcanoes, which is quite I don't know, scary, I guess, knowing that
and it's
what
a
we're
really
causing.
good point that you make about that comparison with the volcanoes, and that's the important thing to remember here. The processes are natural, but the causes are not, and we are at fault for this current situation, and we have to act to prevent this extinction event because we are animals too, and we are at as great a risk of extinction as other species, and we should act out of a moral obligation. We've caused the problem and it's affecting other species, therefore we should fix it. But if that's not enough of a push factor, then we should act out of a self-preservation, because there's no way that we cut down the Amazon and the Sahara gets bigger and we're just fine. There's no way that we walk away from this.
We won't be fine.
Yeah.
I think we should be worried about being on the extinction list. Even if you don't care about the planet, the fact that you as a species could go extinct should be a trigger to make you maybe want to do something.
And so I think perhaps now that we've kind of explained what climate change is and why it's different in the current scenario to previous scenarios, we should probably lay out some of those causes which are causing these kind of natural extreme climatic processes. So the one that springs to mind immediately is the greenhouse effect, which we hear a lot about, right?
Yeah, and I think this greenhouse effect is perfectly kind of fits into that, what you just said. I thought was so nice, Robi, of the processes are natural, but the causes are not, because the greenhouse effect is an incredibly natural process. It's what keeps the Earth's climate livable. Liverpool?
I hope it doesn't keep the Earth's climate livable. Oh my god, that would be... Imagine how grey that would be.
Oh my god.
Bloopers.
We're so keeping that in.
The greenhouse effect is an incredibly natural process. It's what keeps the Earth's climate livable. It's definitely not a bad thing on its own. So essentially what the greenhouse effect is there are certain gases in the Earth's atmosphere that trap heat, and they let sunlight pass through the atmosphere, but they prevent the heat that the sunlight brings from leaving the atmosphere. So the main greenhouse gases doing this are water vapour, carbon dioxide, methane, ozone, nitrous oxide, and chlorofluorocarbons. Not easy word to say.
Ooh.
So
yeah, I think that's a long word.
Chlorofluorocarbons. There's a lot of O's and U's in there. So the more greenhouse gases that concentrate in the atmosphere, the more heat that gets locked in. And the more heat that remains trapped within the atmosphere, which causes our planet to heat up and to stay warm. So without this greenhouse effect, the Earth's average temperature would be around minus 18 degrees Celsius instead of this kind of present average that Emma mentioned of 15 degrees Celsius.
Which would be too cold to support life, right?
Yeah, it'd be too cold to support, the vast majority of life.
So we need the greenhouse.
Yeah, so that's why it kind of keeps our planet in this sort of stable equilibrium that can support life by allowing the temperatures to stay higher, basically. So level of greenhouse gases have gone up and down.
I'm just sort of going to say that that's kind of what makes Earth unique as a planet, in terms of other planets do have an atmosphere, but they don't have this same ability to maintain a stable temperature, whereas you've got other planets without an atmosphere that just literally it drops to in the minus 200s at night and in the positive hundreds during the day. Like, it's such an extreme temperature fluctuation that life can't survive there, not Earth.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of what allows, as you said, life to live on this planet. So it's an very natural process and a really fundamental process. But it is also the kind of biggest cause of current climate change. And again, as we've said about temperatures, levels of greenhouse gases have gone up and down throughout the Earth's history, but they had been fairly constant for the past few thousand years. And that meant that global temperatures had also stayed pretty constant throughout this period. But in the last few decades, humans have enhanced the greenhouse effect through the burning of fossil fuels and other activities that emit greenhouse gases. This is warming the Earth significantly and at an accelerated rate. So essentially, through burning fossil fuels and these activities, we are releasing more of these gases into the atmosphere, which is enhancing the greenhouse effect, which means more heat is being trapped, which is why average global temperatures are on the rise.
There's a diagram that kind of showed this well, which was like, imagine, so the greenhouse effect is kind of like a blanket, and if you were there and someone just started piling loads and loads more blankets on top of you, you would start to feel uncomfortably hot. So the idea that it is natural, you need this blanket, but imagine kind of like this earth just covered in loads and loads of blankets, and then that's the accelerated effect of greenhouse.
And it's interesting
gases.
what you note about the last few thousand years being pretty stable. So in this Holocene interglacial periods tend to be pretty stable climatically. They're the kind of stable baseline, and then the glacials are the really extreme when it gets really cold. And so it's interesting when people say, oh, the Earth has always been warming. Well, actually, this current Holocene interglacial has been pretty stable, and that's probably been quite a big factor in how humans have been able to spread across the planet so easily. But then, when you look at the ice cores and you realise, oh, in the last couple of decades, it's gone through the roof, and the evidence is pretty uncontroversial.
Yeah, exactly. It is worth noting that human activity isn't the only factor affecting the Earth's climate. There are natural causes as well, such as volcanic eruptions and just variations in solar radiation from sunspots, solar wind, and also just the position of the Earth in relation to the sun. But climate models looking at climate change do take this into account, and it's estimated that these natural factors only contribute for around 2% of recent warming. Humans, on the other hand, have increased the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere by more than a third since the Industrial Revolution. So yes, these natural changes are happening, and they have historically taken, thousands of years, but we're now doing it over the course of a couple decades. And you think, these big volcanic eruptions that emit all these gases, they are one-off events that happen incredibly rarely, whereas we're burning fossil fuels every single day. So yeah, kind of speaking of these kind of fossil fuels, this human activity, Emma, do you want to talk a bit more about what we mean when we say that?
Yeah, I think it is important to talk about fossil fuels, because I would say this is kind of the biggest cause of this accelerated warming that we're experiencing at the moment. So fossil fuels are basically, so it's oil, gas and coal. And so these are historically things that they're formed through natural processes fundamentally. So when you've got decaying animals or dead animals which sort of collect at the bottom underneath layers and layers of rock and is sort of compressed there, they have been there for millions of years, compressed sort of in this rock. And then now we're drilling for oil, mining coal, things like that, and that is bringing all of this up to the surface and releasing huge amounts of greenhouse gases which were trapped. I think that's the important thing to mention. They were kind of locked away, and like that sort of in the Industrial Revolution, and now they're just being released at a really, really accelerated rate. So yeah, we've already made kind of this comparison of human activity compared to the natural volcanic eruptions, but so globally we're releasing 100 times more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than all of the world's volcanoes combined. So that is the scale of the release of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. It's very, very extensive.
And it's interesting, that point you made, that this started since the Industrial Revolution. And I think sometimes it's very easy to just kind of say, oh yeah, it started in the Industrial Revolution, that's it. But modern society, especially highly developed, perhaps what you would call them Western countries, still have a vast carbon footprint, even though it might have shifted slightly from fossil fuels now to electricity and things like that. But even electricity still has a massive carbon footprint, which we will come to later. Sorry, that was a little tangent I just popped into my head.
No, I think that's an important point to make. It's like, yeah, even though this kind of started in industrial times, we're still not really shifting away from fossil fuels. And also now you've got developing countries that are emerging, and they want to develop in the same way that the Western world did. So now that they're seeing an increase in the usage of fossil fuels, and this is basically used to currently power the way we live. So everything that we use, everything that in our house has to be made, which takes energy, which requires, ultimately you can trace most things in human life back to fossil fuels. And the reason we can kind of understand this and understand greenhouse gas emissions is there's a lot of research going on with glacial ice cores. So they can tell us a lot about past and present sort of composition in the atmosphere, basically. So what they can do is drill down these huge ice cores, like these cylindrical structures, and there will be these bubbles of ancient air kind of that are trapped in the ice. And so you can actually look at the chemistry of the ice and date this back for thousands, if not millions of years, and look at past temperature trends and also carbon dioxide. Because you've got these trapped bubbles, you can measure levels. So
it's a bit like Jurassic Park. It's the same. It's the same idea with the mosquito in the amber.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And so I think what's interesting to note is once they started studying carbon dioxide and temperature, what they realised is how linked that they are. So as temperature goes up, carbon dioxide goes up, and likewise the two lines are literally interjoined. So they go up together and they go down together. And so over the past 800,000 years, atmospheric carbon dioxide was never really higher than 280 parts per million. So that's just the unit that we use to measure carbon dioxide. And so this was until we started adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And we are now, so currently, I think we're about 415 parts per million. And this is 40% higher compared to when carbon dioxide was just varying for natural reasons. And so we're headed well towards 500 parts per million, which is 100 to 1,000 times greater than the pace at which carbon dioxide levels have fluctuated naturally. So I think that just gives you a scale of how human activities, predominantly through the usage and extraction of fossil fuels, how much of an effect this is having.
And it's, we tend to focus a lot on fossil fuels as we absolutely should, because they're one of our biggest kind of causal mechanisms that we're doing to push this climate change forward. But the other interesting aspect of that, which I think a lot of people kind of clock when we talk about, endangered animals like pandas and tigers and things, but actually in regards to climate change is also habitat destruction, right?
Yeah, this is definitely a big cause of kind of accelerated climate change. So certain habitats act as valuable carbon sinks, which means they absorb and hold carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they either lock it in biomass or in the ground. So the most famous of these is tropical rainforests. We kind of always talk about the Amazon being the lungs of the planet, and as you learn in school, in science, the process of photosynthesis, plants literally take carbon dioxide and turn it into oxygen. So that's kind of why we consider the Amazon the lungs of the planet, because they're creating the oxygen that we need to breathe. Boreal forests also play a massive role. Forests in general, great ally for climate change in sucking up all the carbon. The global ocean is actually the kind of single largest carbon sink, which traps billions of tons of carbon deep in the ocean. And also often overlooked is permafrost, which is another one that freezes carbon or other greenhouse gases. And a lot of the carbon frozen in permafrost is actually there as methane, which is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. I think, again, as Robi said, we focus on fossil fuels. We also focus on carbon dioxide a lot because that's kind of currently the problem, but methane is actually a much more powerful greenhouse gas with a much greater warming effect. So that's definitely something that the permafrost is locking down for us at the minute. So melting permafrost due to global warming destabilizes whole areas as the ground collapses beneath buildings, and this also has the risk of pathogens and diseases re-emerging, which have also been trapped along with these carbon sinks for millions of years. So while we continue to destroy habitats, like cutting down the oceans for, agriculture, and due to increased temperatures, permafrost melting and things like that, that is another reason that is sort of another cause accelerating global climate change.
I mean, that's terrifying, the idea of hidden prehistoric viruses in the permafrost. I mean, we're recording this in fingers crossed, the tail end of lockdown 3 in Britain. I'm gonna touch wood. There's a wooden chair there.
Yeah.
But that's a really scary thought, that not only all this methane's gonna come bubbling up out of Siberia, but also all these ancient diseases.
I think that's absolutely terrifying, because we won't have any evolved immunity or defences against them, and whether any modern medicine would actually work, because we've never encountered these pathogens before. I think, it's quite a scary thought, especially in the middle of a pandemic now. I'm like, I really don't want a million-year-old virus emerging.
Yeah, and I think it speaks well to kind of the cascading kind of nature of climate change, because a lot of current, ecological problems like habitat loss and destruction accelerate climate change, and with climate change it just brings more problems, and it really doesn't make anything better. I read a book recently called The Uninhabitable Earth, which I really recommend for anyone who wants to read more about climate change, and he, in his conclusion, there's a guy called David Wallace Wells, I think was the author's name, and he basically said there is nothing good that is made more abundant by climate change, but there are so many bad things that are made more abundant by climate change, and it sort of makes bad things worse and doesn't really make good things better. So it's a really scary force, and these things like diseases coming out, diseases will spread quicker in a warmer environment. Permafrost melting, losing carbon sinks due to global warming, enhances global warming, and it just goes round and round and round, and that's why it's so important to kind of catch it now, almost. In the same way you can kind of think about the pandemic. If you locked it down earlier, would we be in a better position? It's quite an interesting parallel.
That's a really kind of nice way of looking at it, that cascading effects. And I think this is a point about also why it's probably not accurate to just call it global warming, because climate change means a lot of other things at the same time. So, the oceans are a massive example of both cascading effects and how it's not just about the warming. So there is the threat of halting the ocean currents, because obviously as the planet warms, the ice sheets melt, and this releases a whole load of fresh water into the oceans. And this is, this has a massive impact on our currents. So at the end of the Eocene and Oligocene, we saw this massive global failing and global shift in ocean currents as a result of Africa and India moving north and the closing of the Tethys Sea. And this caused a massive marine extinction. All those famous prehistoric whales like Basilosaurus and Dorodon, they all went extinct. But as you release all that cold water, all that cold fresh water into the oceans, you disturb the current cycle. And so this is a massive impact of climate change, which isn't necessarily warming. So the cold, salty water, which is denser, will sink to the depths and flow to the tropics, whereas the warmer water rises. And this is what naturally happens and flows back to the poles. This creates a global conveyor belt, circulating all the nutrients and the oxygen in the oceans. And this conveyor belt is one of the key things which regulates our climate. You hear about it when you watch Blue Planet 2 and David Attenborough's talking about the Benguelas current, which is bringing up all this great nutrients from the depths. But if you release all the fresh water into the ocean, that is now imperiled, because the fresh water has less energy in it because it's cold and doesn't have as much energy as the salty water, and it just kind of sits there. And so if global currents shut down, you will affect the entire climatic system of the entire planet.
I think to me that's very scary, because I think at school we were taught kind of the possibility of it altering, like climate change altering global ocean currents. But I think this is quite new evidence suggesting that currents could halt completely, like this massive conveyor belt of nutrients and food and oxygen and heat could stop completely. Like there's areas currently where you've got stagnant sort of fresh water that's not moving, which is very scary, I think, and a new effect of climate change.
And it's really interesting when you look in the fossil record about how many times there have been mass marine extinctions because of changing ocean currents, and the amount of times that then trickles onto a terrestrial extinction, because if you shut the currents down, the whales are going to die. But if you shut the currents down, you change the clouds and you change the monsoons and you change the dry season and the rainy season, and whole terrestrial ecosystem shut down. And it's what's really interesting is that at the end, so the Mesozoic mass extinction, which wiped out the dinosaurs with the big asteroid came in, and then after that, for the first few tens of millions of years, you had a global kind of rainforest, which the mammals kind of really started evolving in. But then when the Tethys Sea kind of shrunk and you had a whole ocean that suddenly disappeared because of continental drift, all of the ocean currents started changing, and that was one of the main causes behind the proliferation of grass and grasslands across the entire world. So changing ocean currents can have a massive effect on terrestrial ecosystems, and we shouldn't ignore the lessons that the fossil record is telling us. I know I'm a paleontology nerd, but I just putting that out there. And nowhere is this more evident than in the polar regions. Less so Antarctica. It's still very impacting there, but more so the Arctic. And glaciers have been seen retreating from between 2001 and the early where we are now. They've retreated more than they have done in 100 years. And you've actually got black and white photos of where the glaciers used to be, and you compare them to where it is now, and there's just a barren valley.
There's a really, really good documentary. If you haven't watched it, so recommend it. It's called Chasing Ice. And I think it's on Netflix. And it's the first time, so it was using time-lapse photography on major glaciers across the world. And this was the first time that people could actually visualise climate change and global warming in action. The amount that glaciers receded in the space of, 3 years was shocking. And I think that shocked people more than scientific papers and studies, because you can visualize it. It's there, it's in front of you, and you can see
Which is quite a nice comment on the power of not only filmmaking through what it can show, but actually the ability to tell a story which might otherwise be lost in the kind of facts and figures of a dry and dusty journal. And of course, the worrying thing about the glaciers is that they're not just melting from the top, but also from the bottom. And there's this statistic that Arctic ice caps have lost 400 cubic kilometers of ice in the last 40 years. Not tons, not meters, kilometers. 400 cubic kilometers. What does that... I mean, if you put it into...
No.
I can't even get my head around that.
A cubic meter of water weighs a ton, doesn't it? Isn't that how it works? A cubic meter weighs a ton. So 400 cubic kilometers. How much ice is that which we've lost?
That's insane.
And just think about the volume that's then adding to the oceans if you've got that turning into fresh water.
Yeah,
that's
and obviously,
huge.
Fresh water floats, it doesn't sink, so that conveyor belt shuts down. And the really scary thing is that lots of scientists now come out and say that even if we're able to limit global air temperature rise to 2 degrees by the end of the century and stop that increase, the oceans already hold so much heat that it will continue melting the ice sheets and raising sea levels beyond that point. Because, the ocean absorbs 95% of solar radiation, so if we build that duvet up... oceans are the really scary one, just because, those extinctions at the end of the Holocene and the Eocene, not only they wiped out the marine faunas, but they gave us the savanna, and that's the kind of scary shift for me.
I'm just trying to find it. So there was a new thing that came out. It was shared by Gordon Buchanan, actually.
Oh,
Love
Gordon.
Gordon Buchanan. He's great. And so it's about placing more sort of focus on the oceans, actually, with relation to climate change. So it was talking about how so a single whale can lock up about 30,000 kilos of carbon in a lifetime, which is the same as 1,000 trees.
Ooh, save the whales.
So what they're saying is... Exactly. So it's called blue carbon. Is this new concept of kind of so looking at oceans of how much CO2 and heat they can actually just take up, like.
And I think someone looked at it. I think they looked at. I think they managed to identify a spike in global atmospheric carbon that corresponded exactly to the whaling, the near extinction of the great whales. So. We really need to save the whales, guys.
Save the whales, save the oceans. Because also with oceans, you've got the whole concept of acidification, haven't you, as well? With increase in carbon dioxide, that's an increase in what's called carbonic acid, which is this weak acid but that has a significant effect on
anything with a calcium carbonate shell.
Anything that
and again,
with shells.
there's precedent in the fossil record for that. So the last time this happened, which I think again was the end Permian extinction, it caused the extinction of 96% of all marine life, because phytoplankton, the things that, you know, the tiny little plant-like animals which go in the thingy, and the bedrock of all marine ecosystems have these calcium carbonate shells. So if you get rid of them, everything goes. Your little fish, your big fish, your marine mammals, your whales, everything goes.
And they produce most of our oxygen, actually, phytoplankton, I think even more than forests, or like, is it getting equivalent to the amount that is produced by trees? Phytoplankton are vital. So yeah, if oceans become acidic, you lose the phytoplankton.
Yeah,
there's a lot at
speaks
stake.
back to the kind of cascading nature of climate change, because if you lose the phytoplankton, there is so much, and pretty much, as you said, it's pretty much the bedrock of marine ecosystems. There will be uncontrollable ecosystem collapse within our oceans, and without life in the oceans, we won't have life on land. They're so interlinked, and we cannot stand to lose this biodiversity if we want a hope of surviving ourselves.
And so bringing it back to that kind of the potential for terrestrial ecosystem loss, this is another area where perhaps you can see the effects a lot easier than the ocean, which is maybe why the ocean doesn't get quite so much attention. But agriculture, both arable and livestock in terrestrial ecosystems, is a really obvious way that you can kind of see the human impact, can't you?
No, absolutely. And I think it's almost, when you look back, like we have been doing historically, and kind of looking at the ecosystems and the sort of the plethora of biodiversity that existed in the past, we realise how much we've lost. And so we're not just talking about habitat destruction and species loss here. Agriculture is also a significant driver in climate change, and particularly related to global warming, because agriculture contributes significantly to greenhouse gas emissions. So this is both through agricultural activities and just land use change. So the main direct agricultural greenhouse gas emissions are nitrous oxide emissions from soils, fertilisers, manure and urine from grazing animals, and then you've also got significant quantities of methane that are produced by ruminant animals, so like cattle. Yes, and cows, sheep.
When we were talking last week, you told me something really incredible, which kind of blew my mind, actually. Do you want to say that about the soil, about when it's left bare? I don't know if you're going to say it later on in the podcast, but that really stuck with me.
Yeah, no, I think soils are, like oceans, maybe underestimated kind of as how they can be massive allies in mitigating climate change. So I'm going to do a separate social bite about soils because they deserve the attention. But basically, what happens if we're degrading soils, and have degraded soils massively since we've expanded agriculture and intensified it. But what happens is, when you have healthy soils, and you've got plant cover and things like that, the soil is held in place, you've got a rich diversity of microbes, and this is actually, they can take up huge amounts of soil. So basically what this means is that soils are these huge carbon sinks, and soil can actually be locked there for centuries, if not moving towards millennia. So okay, I'm going to get carried away here because I'm going to explain this in the social bite. But basically, if you have these degraded soils, which is just no cover, just loose topsoil, it's vulnerable to erosion, and just this scary statistic that I read is, if we do nothing about soils, we could lose the entirety of the remaining topsoils in 60 years, which, the way that they put that is, we basically have 60 harvests left if we don't preserve soils.
Oh my God.
And so the idea is, when you have healthy soils, takes up loads of carbon dioxide, important carbon sinks, vital allies in climate change. Unhealthy soils, just intensive agriculture, ploughed, tilled, exploited extensively, is releasing huge amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So agriculture has a massive impact, and I think this is when we need to be working with farmers and sort of teaching them about the importance of the emissions that they can produce, and also healthy soils as well.
So that's quite a nice way to kind of jump into the next section of this podcast, which is basically we're going to talk to you about what have we already lost to climate change and what we stand to lose further down the line at kind of current models, and if we do nothing and stuff. So this might be a little bit depressing part. I mean, part 1 will definitely be more depressing than part 2, but we really want to do this justice and kind of illustrate the scale of the problem we're facing, so that in part 2 we can completely focus on action and what actually can be meaningfully done. So kind of building on what you were saying about agriculture, I guess that links in really clearly. The most tangible thing that we can visualize is the biodiversity crisis, and stuff like Attenborough's fantastic recent documentary "A Life on Our Planet." I thought really, knocked that out really nicely, and Extinction, the facts as well.
No, absolutely, and I think, like you're saying, it's so important to kind of recognise what's at stake if we do nothing, which highlights why it's so important that we do take current action. So I think the biodiversity and the climate crisis are so interlinked, because as the climate changes, becomes increasingly unpredictable, you are going to have these massive knock-on effects on biodiversity and habitats that they inhabit. So current is, I think, quite shocking. Like we mentioned before, extinctions have happened in the past, they will always happen, but currently extinction rates in flora and fauna are happening 100 times faster than in baseline rates. So again, this accelerated rate of extinction, same with climate change, that is being caused by human activity. So as conservationists, animal lovers, zoologists, to me, I think, and to all of us on this podcast, it's very scary that we face losing half or up to 3/4 of species on our planet if we don't do anything about climate change. And so even if we think about this day to day, we're losing 200 species every single day. We face losing entire ecosystems. And I think, like you mentioned, Kate, or it might have been you, Robi, about this idea of the 6th mass extinction, the fact that this is the first time another species is causing an extinction, I think says a lot about the actions of our own species. And we're already seeing this, like you said, Robi, there's various documentaries at the moment documenting the effects of climate change on animals. So drought affecting elephants, which are dying of thirst, and then you've got turtles, which are sort of swimming further north than ever before, and then when the oceans actually get cold and they get this cold shock, they're stranded. And there are people doing some fantastic work, but it's affecting wildlife in so many ways.
The turtles was a really interesting example, because I think, if you're not familiar with turtle ecology, as I'm not particularly, you might think, okay, turtles, climate change, ocean warms, and they just keel over because it's too hot and they die. But it's actually a lot more complicated than that, because the climate changing is forcing changes in their ecology, which they're not adapted to deal with. And it comes back to that kind of... it's too fast. It's too fast. If it was over thousands of years, maybe the turtles would be fine. But as it is, in this kind of decades thing, right, they get the cold shock, they go north, then they get shocked when it comes cold. And I thought that was a really nice kind of illustration of that.
Yeah, and I think an important point to make just while we're talking about the biodiversity crisis is if you at home are listening to this and thinking, okay, but does it really matter if we lose certain species, if turtles go extinct, or if you hear other people ever saying that? I think the David Attenborough documentary you mentioned illustrated very well our reliance as a species on biodiversity, and this kind of equilibrium that we talk about of our planet being inhabitable is because of biodiversity. And if we cannot survive alone, we cannot have this complete monogamy of just human beings. We rely on ecosystem services for pretty much everything we do, but we also need biodiversity just regulating our planet. And so it really does matter a lot if we're losing these species. It's not a case of, oh, well, if we lose elephants in Africa, does that really matter to me day to day? Yes, it does. And it's more the fact that we're losing this mass extinction will be the problem. The odd species we could probably live without, but losing species at this rate, this current rate of biodiversity loss, is a massive threat to us as well.
I was just going to say, to put that in perspective of turtles, just because we're on turtles at the moment. So, okay, you might think, I can live without turtles. Humanity will be just fine without turtles. But there was a really nice quote. I don't know who it was in the Missing Links by Ross Barnett, but I don't know who gave the quote. And he was talking about the Stella's what was it called? Stella's sea cat. And it was no species is an island. No species exists in isolation. So if you sit there and think, right, I can deal without the turtles, let's just unpack that. So we lose every single turtle in the ocean. Turtles are massive predators on jellyfish. So that means if we lose all the turtles, we're going to have a massive overabundance in jellyfish in the oceans. That's going to cause a massive increase in predation on smaller fish species, which is going to decrease the food species for the middle level fish species, which is going to decrease the prey for the larger fish like sharks and indeed whales and dolphins. So you're not just losing the turtles there. You're losing the turtles, you're gaining the jellyfish, you're losing all these other fish. You'll have a reduction in marine mammals, I would imagine. And also that's going to have a massive impact on fish stocks. And how many people rely on fish stocks around the world for their livelihoods? I mean, all the people who live on the coast. How many times do you eat fish every day? So you might think that you can live without the turtles, but it's never just going to be the turtles. It's going to be the whole cascading thing.
Yeah.
And if you lose one element of the marine ecosystem, the next one goes. And it's dominoes, isn't it? It's dominoes.
Yeah. And I think an important point to mention as well with that is...
yeah, it's this cascading thing we keep talking about.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a cascade, and the fact that you need this healthy diversity of species to have a healthy ecosystem. Because we've seen this when we've talked about keystone species and things like that. If you lose something like the elephant, the entire ecosystem changes, and then we rely on ecosystems for a variety of things, for resources, for things, say, like mangroves, a huge sort of protection of coastal areas against these massive storms. If they aren't healthy, our cities and our people are also not protected. So it's all linked, I think. So obviously there is a huge impact on biodiversity, and biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis are very strongly linked. But there's also major impacts on humans, and it's kind of estimated that with every 1 degree rise in temperature, 1 billion people will be pushed towards, will be pushed into living into these unlivable extremes, which could trigger one of the biggest human migrations in history. So climate refugees being forced from their homes and migrating all the way around the world. So Robi, do you want to talk about this a bit more, the impact on people? Because this is serious.
Yeah, and I think it's very important that, you know, we've gone through all these impacts to the environment, and I think it is important that we talk about directly and we visualize directly the impacts to people. The one that springs to my mind immediately is the collapse of global agricultural systems. So Emma, already you spoke about the kind of the soil degradation. Okay, maybe we've only got 60 harvests left, we're going to lose the topsoil. And there are actually 2 examples that I can think of immediately where this is already happened because of human effects and is already happening again because of climate effects. So this isn't hypothetical. We know it can happen, and we have examples where it is happening. The first one to spring to mind is the expansion of the Sahara Desert. So we know as a result of global climate change altering these conveyor belts, these kind of climatic cells, above, I think they're called Hadley cells, in the atmosphere. The Sahara Desert is expanding. There is increased desertification. And in that narrow kind of band, like above the Congo and above the savannah, but below the Sahara, it's a belt called the Sahel. And it's got the fastest growing human population on Earth. And it's countries like Chad, northern Nigeria, Niger, bits of West Africa, Sudan, the end bit of Ethiopia, bits of Somalia. It's that belt across Africa, across its widest part. And the expansion of the Sahara there, in a region with the fastest growing human population on Earth, is having massive catastrophic effects on agriculture. So a lot of the agriculture in the region is a mix of kind of nomadic pastoralism. And so if you've got these large herds of cattle, they're dependent on water, they're dependent on fresh pasture, and this is vanishing beneath the sands of the Sahara Desert as it expands. And so fastest growing human population on Earth is rapidly becoming unable to feed itself. It is a significant driver of not only conflict in the region because of increased conflict over the reduced resources, it also inflames religious tensions. And you know, there is a kind of a migration event happening north over the Sahara into Europe. And if you're European and for whatever reason, if you're concerned about that, I'm very concerned about for the welfare of, for instance, migrants who are crossing the Mediterranean in these rickety boats. You have to take an issue with that, because that's a very, very obvious impact of how climate change is currently having this impact. The other one that kind of springs to mind is the Aral Sea. So those giant inland Asian seas, Black Sea, Caspian Sea, and then the last one over was the Aral Sea. It's basically dried up. And yes, it was because of intentional Soviet diverting of the Amu Darya and I think the Sir Darya rivers. But already the Aral Sea, because it's this kind of landlocked endoheric basin, had been facing massive pressures as a result of climate change. And it's basically all gone. And it completely destroyed the agricultural industries of places like northwestern Turkmenistan, the borders of the Caspian Sea. There was a whole fishing industry which there has collapsed. And it's gone. And we're not going to get it back. And the kind of the reflooding of the Aral Sea is not going particularly well, even though people are working on it. And so we have examples of where global agricultural systems can collapse directly as a result of anthropogenic and climate change. So, yeah, to me, that's the most obvious one. But I suppose the other really obvious one, what springs to your mind, Kate?
I think one that we've sort of mentioned that is quite scary is the kind of increased frequency of extreme weather events. So more flooding, more drought, and these are caused by changes in atmospheric conditions. So we can kind of expect that dry seasons, and we're seeing that dry seasons are becoming drier and lasting longer. So having more intense droughts with longer periods without rainfall. And this is obviously affecting, wildlife, but it massively affects people living in those areas as well. And kind of links to the kind of possible collapse of agricultural systems, as you said. If we're having periods of drought, it's harder to grow food. The destabilisation of the weather is kind of a big concern. The Earth climates used to be very predictable. Obviously, you might hear that and say, oh, the weather forecast is always wrong. But the climate of the Earth was very predictable. But the weather is becoming more and more erratic and more unpredictable. And there are also increased numbers and longer lasting forest fires. And these fires are more extreme, which again can lead to just the direct loss of life, but also the loss of agricultural land. We've also got intensified coastal hurricanes and storms, so more water being pushed inland as sea level rise as well, and greater, more intense hurricanes. And as the oceans warm, they gain more energy, and we know that heat energy is kinetic energy, and so more energy in the sea increases the kind of destructive power of these extreme weather events. Something that's quite kind of necessary to point out is that when you have a specific extreme weather event like a hurricane or a tornado or a fire or a drought, it's at the moment it's really hard, it's all pretty much impossible to say that this is being caused by climate change. The kind of recent weather that they had in Texas, the extreme blizzards they were having in Texas, there was a lot of talk of, is this climate change, is it not? And you can't really pinpoint and place all the blame on climate change on a specific event. But what we do know is that climate change is increasing the frequency and extremity of such events. And so there is a definite link there that's really, really important to be aware of and has a really direct impact on humans because, just through simply loss of life, but also massive impacts on where we live, how we live, the loss of homes, the loss of land, and the loss of life is pretty paramount when you have these kind of events. Something else I just wanted to touch on from what you said, Robi, about potential for increased conflict with climate change, with the collapse of agricultural system. And also you can see this with the aftermath of these events, you tend to see conflict. And a lot of people do predict that these kind of resource wars that we will see in the future where we don't have enough food and we don't have the stability and there will be increased conflict. And some climate scientists kind of predict the majority of people that will lose their lives due to climate change will lose their lives in war. And that's horrible to think that we could have these extreme conflicts due to climate change.
And it's really horrible to think that, you know, they could lose their lives to war when, you know, the 20th and 21st centuries have been, yeah, we've had some really awful world wars, but they've been the most peaceful in world history, and that trend is really obvious when you look at it. The world is getting more peaceful, so it's kind of terrifying to think we might revert to that stage. The one that kind of springs to mind, I think, Emma, you'd probably, what do you think about this? I'm sure you've heard about it because you used to live in Ethiopia. There's you know, mutterings of conflict because the Nile obviously arises in Ethiopia, goes through Sudan, and ends up in Egypt. So Egypt and Sudan are very worried about, well, what if Ethiopia decides, nope, we're gonna take the water from the Nile and they can control that, and that's the kind of water war or resource war which climate change is going to exacerbate.
I mean, I think very much the water war is already happening. You've had to have had political talks between, like, okay, we're forming, I mean, basically like a peace treaty in terms of they have to maintain good relationships, otherwise the countries further up the Nile could literally shut off water supply or exploit it to the point that downstream it isn't flowing fast enough, or it's so polluted, or so much sediment in it that the downstream communities would be hugely negatively affected. And I think it's important to note with this that the people who are going to be most affected by climate change are probably already those that are incredibly poor, living below the poverty line, and are already marginalised in society. Like you were saying, Kate, with that quote that sort of climate change will make bad things worse. That is so the case with weather conditions becoming more extreme for these already difficult conditions.
And that's really a really nice point, that, you know, it'll make the bad things worse. I mean, one thing that which pops into my head, you know, as someone who's got a lot of South Asian family members, or, you know, Southeast Asia is very wary of growing Chinese expansion, both military and economic. And, you know, a lot of India kind of hides behind the Himalayas in this regard and uses it as a barrier. But all those giant South Asian rivers, Brahmaputra, Ganges, Mekong, they all arise in the Chinese-controlled part of the Himalayas. And so, you know, if climate change exacerbates these regional geopolitical conflicts, that's the whole corner of Southeast Asia which stands to be, you know, dried up if a power on the other side of the mountains decide, no, we're going to put a dam there. So that's the kind of really kind of terrible exacerbation we're talking about there.
And I guess not just drying up, but you've also got the risk of rising sea levels, haven't you? That could claim entire cities and communities.
Yeah, and you might not think it, but actually, how many cities, when you name them off the top of your head, are really near the coast or on the coast? LA, London, it might not be on the coast, but it's on a pretty wide river estuary. You know, we live on coasts because that's where we get our food and our transport and our trade. New York, Manhattan Island is literally an island. And so rising sea levels threatens all of these places. So there's a statistic that a minimum of 150 million people will be displaced by rising sea levels, if it's between 1 to 3 feet sea level rise minimum in our lifetime. You know, island nations, the Maldives are very worried about this. The Seychelles, which are built on these kind of atolls, will just be gone. Again, there's precedent for this. There are sunken cities in the Mediterranean, and especially in the Black Sea, little settlements which vanished when the water levels rose. London, as I live in London, that's quite a concern to me because the Thames Barrier is not going to do much if the water level rises by 3 feet globally. That's going to be most of central London underwater. Where I am now, I'm quite close to the Thames, would be flooded. So that is, you know, where are all those people going to go?
I mean, that's the thing, we're talking about one of the biggest mass migrations, if not the biggest, in human history. And
Absolutely.
It's like, if you think this isn't going to affect you, where are all these people going to go? This is westernized countries as well. They're going to have to go somewhere. We're going to have a lot of climate refugees coming to Europe, and we can't just turn people away because we could be the ones affected by this in decades to come. It could be us.
Someone said something quite nice. I'm not quite sure who it was, but it was an interesting point. They said, if you're a European and you're opposed to increased migration in Europe, then you have an obligation to really come out strongly and try and combat climate change because it's only going to make it worse. So I thought that was quite an interesting, you know, interesting flipping of that coin in that regard.
Yeah, and again, it kind of speaks to this cascading issue that we keep coming back to, because inequality that we already have, particularly racial inequality and gender inequality, will be exacerbated by climate change. And we really don't have a hope of tackling climate change unless we simultaneously tackle social injustice. 80% of people expected to be displaced by climate change are women, and BIPOC communities, and particularly Black communities, are massively disproportionately impacted by climate change compared to white communities. And so there's a massive responsibility to tackle those issues head on if we want to try and tackle climate change. And I think the fact that it will exacerbate inequality is a really, really important point.
And I think that exacerbation of inequality, again, will, they'll be worse off hit by disease and war. And I think disease is the really interesting one, because in the current COVID pandemic, we've been seeing some of these inequalities, in regards to access to healthcare and living standards, which maybe we didn't think about quite so much before in wider society. You might think, okay, some people are poor, some people are less poor, but you wouldn't have clocked the link to how badly disease impacts that. But disease is another area where climate change is going to hit.
Yeah, because sort of pests and pathogens may spread more rapidly at higher temperatures, which threatens, people, but also crops and livestock. And we also may have tropical diseases spreading into more temperate regions, as we kind of mentioned with the turtles. With climate change, we're tending to see a poleward migration of several species. And that could include bacteria, diseases, viruses spreading from the tropics into more temperate regions, which obviously threaten the people who live there. So that's another, spread of disease is another kind of impact on humans.
Because I think a point to mention there with disease, just how a lot of diseases are spread, it uses vectors, and a lot of that is through insect vectors. And so the reason we don't have things like yellow fever, dengue, other things like that, which are maybe spread by mosquitoes currently in sort of the northern hemisphere, is just malaria is a climatic concept. It's just too cold. But if our climate warms as it is and this spreads, then you've got all these insect vectors, which can be like, woohoo, new area to basically colonize and infect more people, which is quite scary and a real threat, I think.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
And so I think, we hope that hasn't been too depressing for you. We hope that we've given you a nice way of visualizing the scale of the problem. We've told you what climate change is, why it's different from previous times, the causes. We've told you the kind of environmental impacts on like a biome scale, and then the direct human impacts. And so I know we all thought that David Attenborough's recent documentary A Life on Our Planet, and also Extinction, the Facts, really nicely laid out the kind of timeline that we're expecting. So we thought we'd just share that with you. Emma, what did David tell us? We tried to get him on the podcast, but he was the B team. So we've got our current expert, Emma Hodson. Next time, if we can get David Attenborough in, we will.
I feel like this is such a big task. I can never replace David Attenborough. But yeah, this is taken entirely from his documentary. So this is kind of his roadmap of basically what could happen if we don't do anything. So this is kind of what's at stake. So in the 2030s, the Amazon rainforest could basically be deforested so extensively that it could no longer hold or produce enough moisture, because rainforests are important sort of self-regulating climates, and it could basically be degraded to a savanna. So you've got Amazon rainforest turning to a savanna in the 2030s, which would cause mass biodiversity loss, affect global water cycles. And you've also got, like we mentioned with the glaciers and ice sheets, the Arctic could become ice-free in the summer, and that means less of the sun's energy is reflected, which will exacerbate global warming even further. So that's just in the 2030s. Oh
God, that's not long away at all.
It's not, and very much in our lifetime, and very tangible that this could happen. And then as you move into the 2040s, like you saying, Kate, with the permafrost, you've got frozen soils that are thawing, releasing huge amounts of methane, which, like you said, is more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. And again, accelerating the range of climate change. We're already seeing unprecedented acceleration like never before in human history. To make this worse, we're really talking about some cascading effects here. And then as we move into the 2050s, the oceans will continue to heat because they take up these huge amounts of heat and greenhouse gases as well. And this will cause them to become more acidic. We're already seeing this. So you'd see coral reefs die on a mass scale. Fish populations will crash, which will obviously affect not only trophic cascades in the ocean, but affect the livelihoods of billions of people as well. So, sorry, it's going to get even more morbid as we move into the 2080s. But I think it's good to know what's at stake, because I think this shocked us all when we heard this. So yeah, as you move into the 2080s, you'd see global food production enter a crisis. So like we mentioned with soils and the degradation that's happening, soils would just become exhausted because of overuse. And you'd see things like pollinating insects disappear. This is already happening in China. They're having to human pollinate crops. They're having to do the jobs that insects once did because they've lost pollinators. So this is going to continue to get worse. And again, the weather would become more unpredictable, more unstable, more erratic weather events. So yeah, and then if we look to like 2100s, you're seeing a possible increase of 4 degrees Celsius warmer. So in part 2, we're going to tell you what it means. Like, why does it matter if we actually increase by 2 or 3 degrees? Because that can get very, very serious. Because large parts of the Earth are uninhabitable. Like we said, this mass human, like climate refugees. You've got millions of people who are rendered homeless. Huge numbers of people moving from areas they can no longer support them, and we'd be well in the middle of the sixth mass extinction, threatening biodiversity and life as we know it. So that's a little roadmap of doom and gloom.
Part 1. Yeah, sorry if that was a little of a intense episode. We thought it was worth splitting it because you can listen to this episode and you can get a real good understanding of both the roadmap, the timescale, and the scale of the issue. In part 2, we're going to look at action. And so it's going to be, I suppose, less inherently negative. We're going to be thinking, okay, what can we do? What can governments do? What can corporations do? And the theme we're going to talk about is individual versus systemic action to tackle climate change. So tune in for part 2. All our links to all our social media, websites, and channels are in the links below. Thank you very much for listening. Watch out for part 2. And again, please, as always, comment and get involved. Tell us about, did we miss any key impacts or causes on human impacts or environmental impacts to climate change that you would like to see discussed? Does any of the evidence not convince you? We'd like to know if you think there are any holes in this theory. We're all entirely certain, as the majority of the scientific community is, but we'd really like to, really like to hear where you feel there could be more evidence if you think that's so.
We've definitely done, I think, the best we can to keep this as succinct, so it's nice to listen to, but we could talk about climate change for days and days and days and not quite cover everything. So we will be releasing more content as well around climate change on our website and various social media channels, as Robi mentioned. So yeah, we'd love to hear from you guys on what you think about climate change. And we hope you're not too depressed. Next part 2 will definitely be happier. Definitely, we promise.
But I think you need that. You need the hard-hitting stuff and then make people buy it. Okay, right, what can I do about it? So, yeah.
So we'll see you next
week.
Stay tuned
for part 2.